For nearly a year, the world has been transfixed as the Israel-Hamas war rages in Gaza. From the horrific Hamas terror attacks of October the 7th, 2023, to the rapid and unyielding assault on the long-encircled Palestinian territory of Gaza, to an evolving war that has brought ruin and despair to the people caught in the middle. This war has been a brutal affair on all sides. But now, Israel has begun to pivot its attention northward, where a threat far greater and more threatening than Gaza's Hamas organization has made itself impossible to ignore. The militant terror organization, Hezbollah, now constitutes a looming threat across Israel's northern border. Entrenched on sovereign Lebanese soil, deeply enmeshed into its host country's political structure, and well supported among the locals, Hezbollah is a much more dangerous beast than what Hamas ever was. They've got access to a wide network of allies and partner organizations across the Middle East. By all accounts, they're the most heavily armed non-state actor in the entire world. And right now, it appears that Israel is spoiling for a fight, not just sometime in the far future, but on a timeline measured in weeks or perhaps even days. So in today's special episode of Warographics, we're going to explore Israel's pivot to new battle lines along its northern border. We're going to look closely at the Hezbollah organization, what they are, what they do, and what they're capable of. And we're going to be precise about just what an Israel-Hezbollah war would look like and why that war would promise devastation far worse than what the last 9 months or so in Gaza have been. The prospect of war between Israel and Hezbollah is not a new one, and certainly not over the course of the ongoing Hamas conflict. In the days immediately following the October 7th attacks by Hamas into Israel, the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, very nearly launched a preemptive campaign across the country's northern border. In the days after the attack, Israeli intelligence had assessed that Hezbollah fighters were massing on the border, potentially prepared to strike southward and add to the devastation and confusion that Hamas had already caused. Per a brief by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, quoting here, the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, deployed fighter aircraft that awaited orders to strike targets in Lebanon. Israeli officials apparently notified the White House around 6:30 a.m. on October the 11th, 2023, that they were considering preventative strikes and requested US support. But senior US officials, including President Joe Biden, pushed back. The quote ends. Israel would hold itself back from launching that strike, and Hezbollah fighters never ended up attacking in large numbers, as Israeli intelligence had feared. But to say that the imminent violence was replaced by peace, well, unfortunately, that would be a lie. In the following months, Israel and Hezbollah began trading near daily small-scale attacks as Hezbollah paramilitary forces ran amok across Lebanese territory, and Israel used its aerial assets in what amounted to a deadly serious game of whack-a-mole. Hezbollah has made the destruction of Israel a cornerstone of its ideology since day one, and Israel has long since gotten used to the security threat Hezbollah presents. So for either side to start pouring personnel and resources into their border region was a rather foreseeable outcome. Before long, the two sides settled into a predictable and violent rhythm, with Hamas launching rockets and sometimes unmanned explosive drones against targets in northern Israel, and Israel engaging in a mix of retaliatory airstrikes and preemptive ones in return. From mid-October 2023 to mid-March 2024, northern Israel and southern Lebanon routinely saw between 150 and 250 individual violent incidents every single week, be they isolated shootouts, rocket attacks, or anything else. The 15 weeks that followed Hamas's October 7th attack saw upward of 4,000 violent incidents involving Israel and Hezbollah on that long stretch of territory. Those included the alleged use of phosphorus bombs and white phosphorus shelling by the IDF, and an incident in which an Israeli tank fired on a group of clearly identifiable journalists, killing a Reuters photographer named Issam Abdallah. So too did they include numerous attacks by both Hezbollah and Israel that killed or wounded civilians and saw a shaky ceasefire quickly broken by Hezbollah. Innocents and non-combatants on both sides of the border were forced to respond, with well over 50,000 Israelis and well over 50,000 Lebanese fleeing the area by or before the first few months of the year. And starting in January of 2024, the low-grade conflict along Israel's northern border began to escalate. The incident that really started the shift came all the way back on January the 8th, when a man named Wissam Tawil was killed in an Israeli airstrike in his hometown of Kirbet Salem, about 10 kilometers from the border with Israel. Wissam Tawil was by no means an innocent. He'd been a Hezbollah fighter for well over a decade by then. But he was also a high-ranking leader within the organization, one who played a central role in an elite branch of Hezbollah called Radwan. The unit's members are commandos, the Hezbollah version of special operators, and it's they who have played a leading role in keeping up Hezbollah's side of the violence against Israel. Twill was, before his death, regarded as one of the group's best and brightest. While he was the first high-level Hezbollah operative killed in the current round of violence, he would not be the last. In retaliation, Hezbollah would launch a direct attack on the headquarters of Israel's Northern Command, the first time that they would attack such a valuable target, but as we're quite sure you can guess by now, not the last. We highlighted the death of Wissam Tawil, a brief and forgotten news clip from half a year ago, because his death was the first time that tensions between Israel and Hezbollah really exploded within the context of their ongoing fighting. Since then, a number of high-ranking Hezbollah officials have been killed, along with people like Saleh Aruri, a man who was killed just prior to Tawil and who was, before his death, the leading emissary by Hamas sent to do business with the organization's northern ally. So too have Hezbollah been willing to retaliate against more and more potential targets, and so too have they been willing to strike such targets preemptively, knowing that they'll draw an Israeli military response by way of bullets and missiles. But it's important to understand just how this conflict has spiraled upward in intensity, because contrary to what international observers might have expected, it hasn't been a strictly linear escalation. Instead, if the two sides are, let's say, climbing a ladder towards conflict, then their escalation on that ladder has followed a predictable pattern. Tensions surge, they get drawn down, but when they're drawn down, they don't quite return all the way down to the level they were at previously. Now, to stick with a ladder analogy for a moment, Hezbollah and Israel might suddenly ratchet their hostilities up and climb to, say, 7 rungs up on the ladder. And then, when they descend back down, they only get down 5 steps. Next time they escalate, they move up 7, come back 5, up 7, down 5, until the base animosity between the two sides, the position they're resting at upon that ladder, is already high enough that when the next round of escalation comes, they'll finally reach the point of no return that's waiting for them at the top of the ladder. Now, it appears that the two sides are finally on that precipice, waiting for the final instigation, perhaps from either party, that'll push them to war. The last few months of fighting have seen a steady rise in intensity from both sides of the conflict. After a massive flare-up in tensions directly between Israel and the nation that props up the Hezbollah organization, Iran, the month of April saw Israel assassinate yet more elite Hezbollah personnel. Hezbollah would send drones deeper into Israel than it had done since October 7th, attacking 2 military bases near the city of Acre, and would launch other drone attacks that injured well over a dozen Israelis in that month alone. May was even worse. Hezbollah would kill multiple IDF soldiers and several civilians and launch strikes on major Israeli military targets, while Israel would kill numerous civilians as well and end the lives of several dozen Hezbollah fighters, including more commanders. And if April and May were worse than ever, then June would be worst of all. After wildfires caused by Hezbollah rockets would send dozens of Israeli soldiers and civilians to the hospital, an 11th of June strike by the IDF killed a man named Taleb Sami Abdullah. Per the IDF quote, Abdullah was one of Hezbollah's most senior commanders in southern Lebanon. To kill him, especially amidst a conflict that was already spiraling, was to kill the most senior Hezbollah member to have died over the course of the conflict thus far. More important than Wissam Tawil, and more important than any other Hezbollah leader, that the organization had already responded with outrage for having lost. On June the 12th, Hezbollah would launch more rockets against Israel than it had done on any day prior in the current conflict, including against 2 IDF headquarters, an air surveillance station, and a military factory that was targeted by a guided missile. The largest barrage of the day would involve over 100 rockets launched all at once. The following day, Hezbollah would attack another 9 Israeli military sites with a mix of rockets and explosive drones. All the while, Israeli warplanes streaked overhead, while its vaunted series of interlocking air defense systems dealt with the worst of the danger. And when it came time for Israel to decide what its response would be, the nation chose to respond not just with airstrikes, but with something far more foreboding. On Sunday, June the 23rd, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took to the airwaves across Israel in a long television interview. In that interview, he made the IDF's posture clear, that the military's ongoing campaign in Gaza is winding down, probably in advance of a transition to a long phase of lower-grade counterinsurgency operations. With potentially many thousands of troops freed up from combat duties against Hamas, those forces will rotate to Israel's north, quote, first and foremost for defense. But the nature of the defense Netanyahu described, clarified Israel's intentions further when he emphasized Israel's desire to see the tens of thousands of civilians currently displaced from northern Israel able to return to their homes. That's a step that is broadly understood to require Hezbollah to be pushed well northward, past the Litani River that runs some 29 kilometers or 18 miles north of Israeli borders. That would push Hezbollah out of an area of Lebanon that the UN designated should be free from Hezbollah and other military personnel and assets not belonging to the Lebanese military proper. But what it would take for Israel to push Hezbollah north of the Litani is nothing short of a full-scale invasion. And by all outward indicators, it appears that an invasion is precisely what Israel intends. In a visit to Beirut in recent weeks, an envoy from Israel's closest ally and geopolitical guardian, the United States, laid the situation out starkly for Lebanese officials. That envoy, a policy leader named Amos Hochstein, provided a message that would almost certainly make its way to Hezbollah's leaders, that Hezbollah should not be confident that the United States could stop a potential Israeli invasion of Lebanon if Hezbollah's continued attacks prompt a large-scale IDF response. Per the Biden administration, both sides appear to be miscalculating under the assumption that they can avoid all-out war while still engaging in their current cycles of escalation. And per the Biden administration, no amount of American pressure can definitively stop Israel from launching an invasion if that's what Netanyahu decides. Yet the response that the US apparently got back from Hezbollah via third-party channels was no more encouraging. Per the organization, Hezbollah may not want a war, but it's confident that if a war does come, it can and will do substantial damage to Israel in the process. With all signs pointing to a potentially imminent war, it's now time that we take a step back and set the table for a potential conflict. To do that, we've got to focus in on two key areas. What do both Israel and Hezbollah have at their disposal in advance of a war, and what alliances and international partnerships will they leverage in order to enhance their chances of victory? First of all, let's focus on the organizations themselves, and to do it, we're going to start with Hezbollah. But before we do, we'd like to emphasize one absolutely critical point. As much as politicians, military organizations, and at times media take pains to downplay the capabilities of non-state paramilitaries, Hezbollah is the exception where that minimizing approach leads people to badly underestimate what is, by all expert accounts, a uniquely formidable paramilitary force. Getting precise insights on the group's strength isn't particularly easy to do, but they're widely understood to be one of, if not the most formidable non-state fighting force in the world. Estimates on their size are wide-ranging, but tend to cluster in on rough numbers of around 20,000 full-time personnel and between 20 and 30,000 reserve personnel. The group's leader, Sayed Hassan Nasrallah, insists that the group is far larger, claiming in 2021 that it had some 100,000 fighters among its ranks, and stating this year that those numbers have grown substantially in the intervening time. No matter their exact number, Hezbollah's full-time soldiers are believed to be quite well trained, both by Hezbollah leaders in training camps and by a wide range of experienced military advisors dispatched from Iran's unconventional warfare organization, the Quds Force. Many Hezbollah fighters are experienced combat veterans, having picked up substantial experience fighting in Syria during that country's civil war and in smaller conflicts across the region. Their training infrastructure is well developed and allegedly modeled on Israel's own military training facilities, including firing ranges, urban warfare simulation zones, driving tracks, and more. Hezbollah's snipers are said to be especially fearsome, and their elite operators, like the Radwan force we mentioned previously, are generally regarded as being highly competent in the realm of asymmetric or guerrilla warfare. The group's reservists are thought to be somewhat less formidable, but they too have often been sent off to Syria in order to pick up combat experience. In an interview with Voice of America in 2016, one Hezbollah commander even described the war as a, quote, dress rehearsal for the next war with Israel. Also during the Syrian civil war, Hezbollah fighters are believed to have received large-scale training from Russian forces and observed their intelligence gathering and tactical decision-making in real time. The group's wide variety of equipment is built to optimize its main offensive weapon, a wide array of missiles, drones, and rockets. Hezbollah is believed to be in the possession of some 130,000 rockets and missiles, including several types of anti-tank, anti-ship, and surface-to-air guided missiles, and rockets with a range well over 100 kilometers. They possess a range of explosive kamikaze drones and have certainly studied the examples of Russia, Ukraine, and Yemen's Houthi rebels, each of which have shown how to pair suicide drones with other aerial attack weapons. While the group doesn't keep heavy ground machinery in Lebanon, they're believed to have some 75 Soviet-era T-55 and T-72 tanks provided by and stored in Syria, along along with armored vehicles, a range of different artillery pieces, and perhaps even a few T-90 tanks. They've also got ample improvised fighting vehicles, basically a range of variations on the general concept of a pickup truck with a machine gun bolted on top of it. Lacking piloted aircrafts or sufficient numbers of advanced surface-to-air weapons, Hezbollah doesn't have the means to prevent Israeli aircraft from taking those tanks out, so they're not part of the low-grade conflict that we've seen thus far, but they could have at least some limited effect in the event of a full-scale war. They're equipped with ample numbers of anti-armor heavy missiles built to take out tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and they field specially trained anti-armor teams that specialize in ambush and camouflage. Its Radwan special forces are trained to carry out deep infiltration operations and assassinations, and they've been praised even by the Israeli forces that they often battle against. Said one Israeli lieutenant colonel of their abilities quoted in a 2011 report by the RAND Corporation, "When an Israeli SOF team encountered Hezbollah SOF on one occasion during a firefight, Israeli team members thought at first that they had somehow become commingled with a separate detachment of Israeli SEALs." On top of that, Hezbollah has recently alleged that it's got yet unknown tools in its arsenal that would be revealed in the event of a full-scale conflict. That could, of course, be empty bluster. But there are a few sorts of weapons that Hezbollah could get relatively easily that could make a major difference. Those include things like Iranian-made Shahed drones and more sophisticated anti-aircraft missiles that could allow Hezbollah to cause problems for Israeli fighter bomber jets. And their small-scale equipment is no less impressive. Hezbollah is known to be in possession of advanced night vision technology that have the proven ability to wage nighttime battles. It's got the ability to use laser rangefinders to designate targets. It can use advanced software to analyze the aircraft and heavy machinery it's fighting against, and it's known to have specialized equipment from laser cutters to stun guns to ultrasonic beacons to ward away enemy dogs. From a defensive perspective, Hezbollah's network of underground tunnels is far more expansive than anything Hamas has ever been able to achieve in Gaza, estimated to include hundreds of kilometers of tunnels distributed among dozens of local defensive networks. They reach far underground. Some are wide enough to fit entire pickup trucks, and they are so numerous that the tunnel clearing and blocking tactic that worked in Gaza will almost certainly not be enough in Lebanon. And then we've got to factor in the Lebanese military, not because they'd fight beside Hezbollah, but because their equipment may end up in Hezbollah's arsenal. It's worth emphasizing that Hezbollah is believed to be substantially better at warfighting than the Lebanese armed forces or the LAF. Hezbollah is better trained, better armed, has far more combat experience soldier to soldier, and shows much better combat discipline among its ground force. They're much better at using small unit tactics, fighting asymmetrically, and deeply instilling a combat culture of martyrdom that makes their troops far more willing to fight to the death. And while the Hezbollah organization and the LAF are quite often at odds with one another, it's important to emphasize that the LAF is both a weak institution and is subject to a Lebanese political system where Hezbollah exerts strong control. It is not particularly likely that the LAF would ever ally with Hezbollah to stand against Israel, but between corruption, underfunding, and poor defensive capabilities around the LAF's own arsenal, it's entirely feasible that the LAF's anti-tank equipment, the American-made tanks and Humvees that are still in working order, the armored personnel carriers, the artillery pieces, and the weaponry that the LAF has at its disposal could find its way into Hezbollah's hands. In a grand view, it is absolutely vital to understand that Hezbollah is not a comparable force to Hamas in Gaza. They are better. Far better, with an arsenal an order of magnitude more dangerous, fighting units an order of magnitude more formidable, on the sovereign territory of another nation where they operate with impunity and where they enjoy broad support from much of the Lebanese public, particularly in southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah is at its strongest. In any Israeli invasion, under any circumstances, they will be fighting on their home turf, in a battle that they've prepared for in the tens of thousands, fully understanding that they cannot win in a head-to-head war with Israel, but fully prepared to make Israel bleed for as long as is necessary to win. But now it's time we talk about Israel, because even amidst the chaos and the horror of the war in Gaza, the Israeli military has thus far fought the sort of conflict where it's hardly showed what its modern arsenal is capable of. Comprised of a military of 170,000 active duty troops. Israel's actual strength today is closer to 500,000 troops, after the country called up some 3/4 of its reservists, although some among them have since returned home. Of those, the vast majority are members of the Israeli ground forces, which can bring to bear some 1,500 or so main battle tanks, which includes those currently kept in storage. Along with those tanks come thousands of stored and deployed armored personnel carriers and fighting vehicles, hundreds of super heavy combat bulldozers, and over 1,000 artillery pieces. In the air, Israel is highly formidable, with nearly 200 F-16 fighter jets, 66 F-15 Eagles, and around 40 fifth-generation F-35 stealth fighters out of an anticipated 75 that will one day fill Israel's arsenal. They bring dozens of attack helicopters, plus aerial reconnaissance, command and control, and refueling capabilities. On the sea, they boast no fewer than 7 missile corvettes that can easily conduct operations against land-based forces, alongside submarines and coastal defense vessels that shouldn't be quite so relevant in a conflict against Hezbollah. But if Hezbollah's greatest strength is its 100,000 or more missiles, rockets, and drones, then the IDF's greatest strength is precisely the weapon to counter such a capability. The skies over Israel are protected by a multi-layered interlocking missile defense network, relying on several different types of interceptors to ensure that the nation's population centers and military infrastructure are protected. To deal with long-range ballistic missiles, Israel has the Arrow, which has proven its capabilities in intercepting cruise missiles launched by Yemen's Houthi rebels, and has the capacity to deal with even nuclear-armed missiles traveling at many times the speed of sound. Then there's David's Sling, a system optimized to protect against medium-range missiles like the ones Hezbollah prefers. And then there's the Patriot missile system, capable of intercepting not only missiles and rockets, but drones at medium to short range. And finally, there's the Iron Dome, a system responsible for many thousands of short-range rocket interceptions over the course of the last decade or so. Coming soon, Israel will even field a laser-based air defense system called the Iron Beam, although that's not yet operational. When it comes to Israel's strengths at war, its abundance of resources is a very good place to start. Israel has an annual defense budget of over $20 billion, and it's developed world-renowned capabilities in concert with the United States, the nations of Europe, and other global partners. It spends that money on cutting-edge technology, frequently taking advanced equipment like the US-made Patriot system and upgrading it to an even higher standard. Israel's military is very well trained, it's a highly respected institution inside the country, and it's not at all focused on power projection overseas. Instead, it spends its time with the singular objective of protecting Israel from a list of known enemies, where Hezbollah features very prominently. Israeli intelligence, it's the stuff of legend, with domestic intelligence organization the Shin Bet and its foreign intelligence service Mossad earning an international reputation one part inspiring and one part terrifying, while its military intelligence service, Amman, is a lower profile outfit that quietly stands between the very best in the world when it comes to tactical wartime intelligence. And finally, there are Israel's estimated several dozen nuclear warheads kept in an arsenal that Israel has never acknowledged directly, and we certainly hope an arsenal that Israel wouldn't consider using in anything but the most dire of circumstances. Before we can really game out a war between these two sides, we've got to account for the other nations and non-state actors that would figure prominently on either side of a potential Israel-Hezbollah war. On the Israeli side, there is no ally more critical, nor any more indispensable than the United States, where almost reflexive support for the Israeli state is one of the few remaining commonalities between most political leaders in a deeply divided nation. Israel enjoys close to a limitless strategic partnership with the US, where even during the darkest moments of the Israel-Hamas war, the United States has continued to send nearly every weapon system that Israel could think to ask for. It's not yet clear, either way, whether the US would consider scaling back its military support in the event of a Lebanon invasion, but if past decisions predict future behavior, then it's certainly an unlikely outcome. Germany is Israel's other greatest military backer, responsible for some 30% of its armament supply in 2023, and while Canada, Japan, Spain, and other nations have stopped selling weapons to Israel since the start of the current war in Gaza, other nations, like Britain and Italy, continue to make their own contributions. On Hezbollah's side, the situation is a bit more complicated but no less important. Hezbollah's main international backer is the nation of Iran, which viewed Hezbollah for a long time as a sort of vassal organization, extending Iran's mission across the Middle East. Now, while that's still somewhat the case, Hezbollah has become far more of a strategic partner to Iran, working toward the same goals from different angles while continuing to accept Iranian military advisors and material support. Also on Hezbollah's side are a far greater network of Iran-affiliated state and non-state actors who have, at various times through their history, referred to their collective network as the Axis of Resistance. Other Axis members include Yemen's Houthi rebels, Hamas in Gaza, the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, and a network of Iran-allied militias in Iraq and Syria. Just like Hezbollah is far more of a threat than Hamas, we must emphasize that a conflict between Hezbollah and Israel will not be like the conflict between Israel and Hamas. There may be similarities, from rockets to tunnels to IDF pinch-and-hold tactics, but when it comes to scale, we are simply on another level. We're talking about a major war, perhaps not between two sovereign nations, but between a highly modernized military powerhouse on one side and a non-state actor that would put the militaries of many nations to shame on the other. Alright, so now we come to it, the real dirty work of trying to figure out what exactly an Israel-Hezbollah war would look like. On that question, perhaps the simplest part is in determining which side is likely to make the first move. Despite Israel's far greater conventional military power, despite its ability to leverage its air superiority and devastate Hezbollah from the sky before a war even begins, Israel is unlikely to be the side that strikes first. Hezbollah's ability to land a surprise attack, one first sucker punch that can send the Israeli state reeling, is something that the organization simply cannot survive without. The reason why is one of Israel's air defense and Hezbollah's ability to punch through it. Israel's Patriot missile system, its Iron Dome, its Arrow, and David Sling all form an exceptionally formidable defensive array, but they've got a critical Achilles heel. Any and every air defense system that relies on firing interceptor projectiles can only intercept incoming rockets and missiles as long as they can load interceptors in time. Each Iron Dome battery can have somewhere between 60 and 100 interceptors loaded at a given time. Israel currently has 10 batteries deployed, and the system is built in a way that it automatically chooses which projectiles to intercept to not waste interceptors on projectiles headed toward unpopulated areas. The Arrow can launch 6 missiles per launcher at any given time, while a Patriot battalion's 4 to 6 missile launcher batteries, soon to be fully replaced by David Sling, will consist of up to 8 launchers with 4 ready-to-fire missiles each. And all of those numbers sound impressive, until you remember that Hezbollah has well over 100,000 missiles and rockets, plus unknown numbers of drones ready to launch in as many small waves or as few absolutely massive waves as Hezbollah wants. Even a wave that used a relatively small proportion of Hezbollah's rockets and missiles, say 10,000 or about 7.5% of Hezbollah's arsenal, would almost certainly overwhelm Israel's air defense systems. Try as they might, the full combined interceptor array that Israel currently has in the field simply will not be enough to stop the wave. If 10,000 projectiles come flying in at once, Israel simply won't be able to reload fast enough to stop even half of them before they reach their targets. Nor will the help that Israel got from the US, Britain, Jordan, and other nations in beating back an April drone and missile attack by Iran be forthcoming here, with Hezbollah firing at what amounts to point-blank range. These other nations simply won't be able to intervene fast enough. It's for this reason that a preemptive strike by Hezbollah could likely visit devastation on Israel that the nation hasn't seen in generations. A former Israeli ambassador to the US, Michael Oren, put it in an interview with Foreign Policy, quoting here, "I've read estimates of what Hezbollah could do to us in 3 days that are just horrendous. You're talking about knocking out all of our essential infrastructure, oil refineries, air bases, Dimona." Dimona, by the way, is where Israeli houses its nuclear research facility. And for our part here at Warographics, the most important implication might not be any of the ones Oren mentioned. Such a massive strike, if Hezbollah could pick its targets correctly, would be able to devastate Israel's missile defense and anti-drone jamming infrastructure and leave it far more susceptible to future waves of attacks. Or even if the Iron Dome and David Sling weren't targets in a first wave, a second wave sent just barely behind would likely allow Hezbollah to hone in on the locations of those defensive systems after they expend their first round of interceptors. A second wave of a similar size would almost certainly be enough to cripple Israel's interception capability. In a scenario that sees much of its missile defense infrastructure rendered potentially inoperable, its northern military bases rocked by targeted missile and guided drone attacks, and potentially with any of its prized aircraft in range left smoking on the tarmac, Israel would still retain the initiative to go on the offense in the immediate aftermath. Even with such a tremendous loss of military infrastructure and IDF and civilian lives, Israel has more than enough reserve forces, more than enough military kit elsewhere in the country, and more than enough will to immediately bring the fight back to Hezbollah. Israel's long-standing plans for an assault to bring down Hezbollah plus up-to-date intelligence would likely see massive airstrikes against Hezbollah's leaders and command and control infrastructure, devastation to the group's missile launch sites, and a wave of cyber attacks that would hamstring the group's ability to operate in the digital realm. The trouble is, it might not be that simple. Although Hezbollah's estimated 20,000 or so high-quality fighters are not enough to face down the IDF, the chaos of a massive and simultaneous air attack would likely give them at least a few hours to launch attacks in northern Israel. Specialist units like the Radwan Force and Hezbollah snipers could do untold damage against military and civilian targets alike, and while their objective likely wouldn't be to hold land inside Israel, they likely wouldn't need to. For all those watching who have been justifiably outraged at the Hamas's organization's conduct over the last 9 odd months, we are very much with you. But this particular point must be made, regardless of how difficult it may be to hear. If there is one Hamas tactic that Hezbollah can learn from above all else, it's the act of taking hostages at large scale will absolutely incense the Israeli military, the government, and the public. But given Israel's current and almost complete inability to rescue hostages in Hamas by timely military means, they become a critical bargaining chip for the violence that is to come. Now, we aren't talking about Hamas at all. We're talking about Hezbollah, an organization with a far more extensive network of tunnels, far more territory, and the option to transport hostages not just to different towns or cities, but across borders, maybe to Syria, maybe to Iraq, maybe to Yemen, maybe even to Iran. And when, after this hypothetical first Hezbollah attack, it comes time for the IDF to come thundering in with its full military might, it's going to enter a combat situation far harder to deal with than Gaza has ever been. Southern Lebanon is a well-populated place, with several minor cities and large towns and a wide scattering of villages and hamlets. Although the Lebanese public has soured on Hezbollah in recent years, it, much like Hamas in Gaza, is likely to see its public support increase as enemy tanks roll through the people's streets. Hezbollah's tunnel network will prove a far tougher nut to crack than those of the Hamas organization, and Hezbollah's defenses both at ground level and below will likely be exceptionally well thought out. The land is rocky, it's hilly, it's dotted with natural caves and patches of vegetation, similar in some places to what US troops dealt with in Afghanistan. This is territory that Hezbollah has been planning to defend for decades, territory that its foot soldiers have likely imagined many times under full IDF assault and have made detailed plans to use to their advantage. Urban warfare is likely to be painfully common, and where Israel has spent the better part of a year dismantling an adversary that was stuck inside a besieged patch of land, it'll now have to reckon with the fact that Hezbollah has all of Lebanon to fall back to. And even more than that, it's here that a potential Israeli offensive against Hezbollah can get even more complicated than it already promises to be. The territory of Gaza was a functionally besieged enclave even before the current war began, wrapped up by Israel to the east, north, and south, and backed to the Mediterranean in the west. And there's that little sliver of border with Egypt that the Egyptians have proved disinterested in using to Hamas's benefit. Hezbollah, though, is based in Lebanon, a country that shares a far longer border with friendly Syria than with Israel. Syria enjoys a long border with Iraq, Iraq enjoys a long border with Iran, and that for the IDF presents a whole rat's nest of issues. Leveraging those borders, Hezbollah can retreat to Syria in a crisis if need be. And while Israel has proved willing to strike territory in Syria, it can only conduct so many strikes against so many targets before Damascus is forced to intervene directly. Lebanon can also receive as much aid and supplies as it likes over its land borders, enabling, say, Iran to pack a box truck with bombs and rifles and drive it all the way from Tehran to the southern Lebanese city of Tyre. Israeli intelligence, although very good at its job, is not good enough to stop the sort of decentralized arms smuggling that could take place all up and down the Lebanese border. And if the Syrian civil war has proved anything, it's that ideological wars in Middle Eastern nations with porous borders can very quickly become a melting pot. In a hypothetical war with Israel, Hezbollah might find itself fighting alongside Iraqi militias, Afghan and Pakistani rebels, uniformed or incognito soldiers from Syria's battle-hardened military, or even elite operatives dispatched from the Iranian Quds Force. Per an NBC News article published on June the 23rd, 2024, a wide range of Iran-backed groups have made clear that they're willing to send up to several thousand foreign fighters to join Hezbollah in battle, and that's what they're willing to send before the war begins. Funnily enough, Hezbollah's leader claims he politely declined the offers, quote, "We told them, thank you, but we are overwhelmed by the numbers we have." Whether he sings the same tune with the IDF bearing down, though, or whether such anti-Israel forces might choose to stream into Lebanon regardless of what Hezbollah says, that's another matter entirely. Israel, for its part, anticipates that an influx of foreign fighters to Hezbollah's side will be all but inevitable. Yet we don't spend all of this time emphasizing just how painful, just how horrific a Lebanon invasion would be for the IDF and the Israeli public in order to create some sort of illusion that Israel might find the war to be too much. That simply could not be further from the truth. If the ongoing war in Gaza has taught us anything about Israel under its current leadership, it is that the value of stamping out an enemy that has done real damage to Israel is worth just about any cost. The comprehensive counterattack, the all-out drive to dismantle the Hamas organization, and often the sheer brutality of Israel's war in Gaza would almost certainly be magnified in response to a larger attack against a more dangerous adversary. Hezbollah can pull Israel into an attritional war, But there is no conceivable military outcome that sees the IDF defeated outright in that war. Hezbollah can attempt to bleed its adversary dry. Hezbollah can attempt to impose such cost on Israel that continuing to prosecute a counteroffensive is no longer in its interest. Yet we've seen time and time again through the Israel-Hamas war that Israel is willing to make trade-offs, from the loss of soldiers to the loss of equipment to the loss of international standing and more, in order to ensure that the enemy that attempted to destroy it once can never do so again. Israel's military statements across the month of June have indicated that the country has already drawn up and confirmed a plan to invade Lebanon, with Netanyahu's senior officers suggesting that the IDF's approach would be similar to the one taken in Gaza thus far. That approach has involved a list of area-based offensives, one after another, to bite down on certain parts of Gaza and clear it of Hamas fighters before moving on to the next. In the stage of the conflict that Israel promises now, that approach will shift somewhat to what Israel calls, quote, mowing the grass, carrying out a long counterinsurgency to identify lingering elements of Hamas resistance and wipe them out before they can grow into something more potent. That strategy, for the record, has been implicated as a root cause of the intelligence and counterinsurgency failures that led to the October 7th attacks of Hamas in the first place. But just like it seems to remain part of Israel's strategy for its upcoming phase of anti-Hamas operations, it'll likely be included in late-stage anti-Hezbollah operations if the IDF gets there, and Israel seems to know it. As the country's foreign minister, Israel Katz, flags to the international press that a decision on a full-scale war with Hezbollah will be reached very soon, he's outright acknowledged that Israel is bound to pay a heavy price in the process. Yet if anything, that only seems to strengthen the Israeli leadership's resolve. Quoting Katz here, "In an all-out war, Hezbollah will be destroyed and Lebanon will be severely beaten." Looming over the entire prospect of an Israeli-Hezbollah war is the one final spectre that we're sure you've anticipated: the potential for a wider war with Iran and potentially other nations of the Middle East. The IDF versus Hezbollah is a war that would be brutal, but it's a war with a clear and predetermined outcome. But the IDF versus the combined military might of Iran, Syria, Iraq, Yemen's Houthi rebels, the foreign fighters from around the world, and quite possibly other Middle Eastern nations as well, well, that's an entirely different story. And if it doesn't sound like such a hard ask for Israel, given their historical record in regional wars, well, go ahead and factor in the potential devastation of the air defense apparatus around which Israel's entire modern military strategy is built. The potential for a regional response isn't just mere conjecture either. On June the 23rd, America's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, warns that the Joint Chiefs' assessment of the situation indicates that Iran would almost certainly give greater backing to Hezbollah than it thus far has to Hamas in the event that Hezbollah was, quote, significantly threatened. Nor do the US or Israel's other global allies appear in any way prepared to put boots on the ground in Israel's defense, meaning that while Hezbollah can rally major support from abroad, Israel may struggle to do the same. And we've already emphasized how interested Iran's non-state partners are in rushing to Hezbollah's defense, a potential outcome that risks making it difficult for national governments, particularly in Syria and Iran, to avoid doing the same. So, that is what the Middle East might be looking at if Israel and Hezbollah do choose to go to war. We certainly absolutely hope that we're wrong about this, but all indicators are that such a conflict would be far more ruinous and could potentially metastasize far larger than anything Israel and Hamas have experienced in the region's current hottest war. With such a fearsome prospect ahead, there's only one other question left to ask: how likely is it that an Israel-Hezbollah war might actually break out? Now, we'll start with the causes for optimism, because quite frankly, after that last section, we deserve a break, don't we? Even as the drums of war seem to beat harder and harder, there's a reason to be hopeful that both sides could move toward an off-ramp. At the time of writing, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is in Washington for, quote, critical talks around the potential risks of escalation with Hezbollah, in what appears to be an urgent attempt by the Biden administration to avert the war. In his televised interview on Sunday, June 23rd, Netanyahu emphasized that Israel was willing to entertain a diplomatic solution before things got worse. Among the fundamental demands for a ceasefire that he listed was a full Hezbollah withdrawal from areas close to the border, plus the return of Israeli residents of the area, and a clear enforcement mechanism to ensure that Hezbollah remained only a distant threat. Hezbollah, too, has signaled via back channels that it would be willing to negotiate, although its own demands include a ceasefire and Israel's war in Gaza. It doesn't seem entirely likely to happen. Both sides don't outwardly appear willing to compromise their terms for a de-escalation, but the mere fact that both sides have seemingly kept the door open to a drawdown of any kind is at least something. And we've got to emphasize here that both Israel and Hezbollah stand to lose far more by going to war with each other than they stand to gain. On Hezbollah's side, a war would almost certainly mean the devastation of Lebanon, the destruction of countless homes, countless communities, countless families, and for what? To fight a war against Israel that will never see Hezbollah's foe vanquished, no matter how bruised and battered it may be. And for Israel, faced with even the difficult reality that it may have to agree to a ceasefire to avoid this northerly war, that embattled PM Bibi Netanyahu might have to step down and face prosecution, isn't that still worth it? Surely, a peaceful resettlement of northern Israel and an attempt to draw down hostilities with Hezbollah is too important to be squandered when the only alternative is a war that will bring far worse destruction than the events of October 7th ever did. Yet to hold any hope that these two sides might avert war requires a person to place faith in both Israel's strategic judgment and Hezbollah's at the same time. And even if a person may be willing to place trust in one of the two, it's very hard to place that trust in both. If the US, for example, is to be taken at its word, then both Israel and Hezbollah have made countless miscalculations in attempting to assert their will over each other in the conflict so far without escalating into full-scale war. Add to that Israel's recent failure in April of this very year to correctly assess that its strikes against several high-ranking Iranian Quds Force commanders in the Syrian city of Damascus would piss off Iran badly enough that a major retaliation would be coming back at them. Quite frankly, add to it the current Netanyahu administration's insistence on the idea that Hamas could be fully dismantled and snuffed out, when quite literally every major global counterinsurgency effort of the last half century has showed that trying to win wars on terror only leads to these insurgencies adapting, going underground, and becoming potential security threats in the long term. Even Israel's defense minister, currently sitting in Washington to discuss a peace, is the same man who warned just recently that if Israel and Hezbollah would go to war, Israel would, quote, return Lebanon to the Stone Age. And even more damning than the track record of both sides when it comes to accurately assessing the risk of escalation, we've got to circle back to a more fundamental point. It's the same one we made as we projected out what this potential war might look like. That if it judges violence to be inevitable, then Hezbollah has very strong incentives to conduct a massive preemptive missile, rocket, and ground forces strike against Israel before troops at its northern border and before Israeli jets can devastate the sites where those vaunted Israeli intelligence organizations have assessed that their arsenal is being hidden. That means that at the same time as Hezbollah might be working to avoid a war, it's most likely also trying to figure out when that critical moment will come, when it's got to either launch its most dangerous ordnance or see it destroyed. That sort of reality makes it far more difficult to hold out hope that Hezbollah will use restraint. And if that's a reality that a writer and a narrator here on YouTube can figure out, then it's almost certainly not news to the IDF. If Israel believes that Hezbollah may attack preemptively, then Israel has reason to try and attack preemptively to thwart such an attack, and the cycle only gets worse and worse from there. Now, we'd like to conclude this special episode with a note of hope, some lingering reason to believe that war can be averted and peace can win the day. But after months spent covering the potential for war between Israel and Hezbollah, we are forced to admit that every warning light is now flashing red. We here at Warographics would like to be wrong. Yet at least for now, Israel's northern border is trending toward all-out war and not away from it. Whether that crisis is resolved or whether the whole situation collapses will come down to factors far outside of our control. For now, we can only urge that you watch closely. Whichever way this goes, we are going to find out soon.